With more on the political developments in Great Britain, we're joined on the phone here in Washington with Nile Gardiner. He's a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. First and foremost, what does this mean for the Brexit debate and the extension now into late January?
Well, I think the general election will be hugely important for the future of Brexit. In fact, this election could well decide the outcome of Brexit altogether. And so the stakes are very high. I would describe the forthcoming general election as one of the most important elections in modern British history. And if indeed the Conservatives are returned with a significant majority, then the Conservative government will move full speed ahead with delivering Brexit, even by the end of December, if not by January 31st. If the Conservatives do not receive a majority in this general election, then I think you will see potentially a great deal of confusion with regard to the path forward on Brexit. It is not certain that the Labour Party will move forward with Brexit. There's a great deal of confusion and mixed messaging with regard to the Labour Party's position. And so I think this election certainly will be critically important for shaping the future direction of Great Britain and Britain's future outside of the European Union.
And as you know, a lot of back and forth and some initial reluctance by the Labour Party to agree to a December election. For Labour and Conservatives, Nile Gardiner, is this essentially the final roll of the dice?
Yeah, I think that this is the final roll of the dice, really, as far as Boris Johnson is concerned, because he's tried with great conviction to get the EU withdrawal agreement through Parliament. This is a deal that he's negotiated with the European Union painstakingly over the course of many months, and Parliament has basically stood in the way of implementing the withdrawal agreement, and the Labour Party has consistently tried to derail the government's efforts to deliver Brexit. And so there's no other choice, I think, for the Prime Minister other than to move forward with a general election in order to resolve the tremendous impasse here. And let's not forget that within the current Parliament, an overwhelming majority of MPs voted against Brexit in the 2016 referendum. So there's this huge disconnect between this Remainer Parliament and the British people who definitely voted in favour of Brexit and who want to see Brexit delivered.
You mentioned that 2016 referendum, and since then, your country's had three prime ministers, David Cameron, then Theresa May, now Boris Johnson. And Prime Minister May did call a snap election, hoping to gain seats in the House of Commons, but that did not happen. Any concerns that this could happen again with Boris Johnson in December?
Yeah, I think that with any general election for an incumbent government, there's a lot of risk. In many ways, an election is always a gamble for a government in power. I do think, though, that there is a significant difference between this election and the 2017 election, in that the Conservatives are led by Boris Johnson. He's a very charismatic figure. He was a leader of the Brexit campaign in 2016. Theresa May, of course, opposed Brexit. And so a lot of Brexit voters didn't have a great deal of confidence in Theresa May. Also, I think that Boris Johnson is a far more charismatic and strong leader compared to Theresa May, who was very weak. And I think also for this election, Brexit voters are going to be very, very energized to turn out and vote in order to deliver Brexit. So I do think that you will have a different scenario here in this election as opposed to the last election, but there is no room for complacency on the part of the ruling Conservatives, and voters sometimes like to punish incumbent governments. And so the government, I think, will be fully aware of all of the pitfalls and the potholes ahead, and will be trying to avoid those as we head towards a general election in December.
We're talking with Nile Gardiner. He heads up the Margaret Thatcher Center at the Heritage Foundation here in Washington. And a historic note, this would be the first time that Great Britain has held an election in December since 1923. As somebody who grew up in London, you know the reason is obvious. Your country is not known for the best weather, also the long hours of darkness in December. So how does that factor in to a December national election?
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true, Steve. London is dark and cold and damp in December, as it is for most of the winter, and which is why one of the reasons why elections are traditionally held usually in May, when it's much nicer. But it is what it is, and the UK is heading for a general election in December, and I would say that these circumstances are unusual. Provisions, especially, have to be made for more elderly voters to be able to vote in very cold conditions. But the big question is whether or not turnout will be lower in this election. I expect that because of the tremendous passions involved over Brexit, that turnout will be very high in this election, even though it's December. And I think on both sides of the political aisle, with pro-Brexit voters and anti-Brexit supporters, I think that you're going to see significantly high turnout for this general election. And I think, especially on the Brexit side, I think Brexit supporters are going to be very, very motivated to turn out to vote, because this may be the only opportunity they have in order to see Brexit implemented. Because if Labour takes power as a result of this election, there's no guarantee that Labour will actually deliver Brexit.
And finally, you follow American politics here in the States. Will this, in many ways, reflect an American campaign in terms of debates, the ads, the speeches, and the strategy?
It's quite different, I think, to a U.S. general election in many respects. Not least the fact that there's a lot less money that goes into an election campaign in the UK. That's all very much restricted by the law. I would say that the style of a British general election is unique. It's different in most respects to an American campaign, but at the same time, you have in Great Britain at the moment with Boris Johnson a very, very charismatic figure who is determined to deliver Brexit, which is monumentally important to the British history. And so it's going to be a very, very interesting election from that point of view. And on the other side, you have Jeremy Corbyn, who is a far-left figure. He's seen as an inspiration for many on the left in America. And this is a battle between a very conservative government and a very left-wing Labour Party. And so it's a real clash of ideologies, actually, in this election in many respects. And that's what makes this interesting, I think, particularly interesting. But as is always the case, the British general election is very unique. It's unique to the UK, different in style, I think, to a U.S. presidential election.
And you have to wonder, will it be maybe a precursor to what we're going to see in 2020 here in this country?
That's a good point. I think the ideological debates that you're seeing unfold, not only in the UK but also all across Europe, will be mirrored here in the United States in November 2020. And there is this great clash at the moment in Britain between conservatives who believe in national sovereignty, self-determination, low taxes, limited government, coming up against a very, very left-wing Labour Party that adopts a much more pro-European approach that is in favour of very heavy government spending and a big footprint by the state. So a contrasting clash of ideologies and visions, undoubtedly, that you'll see playing out in the UK in the next few weeks. And I think that certainly will be mirrored to some extent in the United States next year.
And as this campaign continues to unfold in Great Britain, we'll follow your work at heritage.org. Nile Gardiner, we thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.